It had all started out so bright. When the Reza Pahlavi Shah came into power in 1925, the future of Iran seemed promising. For example, in his campaign to modernize Iran, the Reza Shah had implemented multiple decrees to advance civil rights. This was particularly true for women, and the Shah even went as far to ban the veil and open many educational institutions to them. He worked to give women more opportunity and was an advocate against polygamy. He encouraged westernized dress and at one point even made it mandatory. This, along with the removal of clerics from government and strict control over religious institutions, made the Reza Shah extremely unpopular with the church, who argued that the Shah was violating the teachings of the Quran, a notable example being the ban on pilgrimage to Mecca. Despite the protest, however, the Reza Shah gained the support of civil servants, merchants, and commercial bourgeoisie, who greatly benefited from the Shah's modernization efforts. The Commercial Code of 1925 in particular gave the way to great economic gain for merchants. The construction of the Trans-Iranian railways during 1938 only served to help industrialization. Politically, the Reza Shah centralized the government and made efforts to seize corruption. He strengthened the military and created a more uniform, progressive nation. In all, it can be said that, although a forceful and radical man, the Reza Shah was skilled and a capable leader who was able to garner the support of many and modernize Iran. However, things would soon change under the hands of the Reza Shah's eldest son, Muhammad Pahlavi Reza. After ascending the throne in 1941, Muhammad Reza soon found his country occupied by foreign powers, his army reduced to the status of mere security guards, and the overall infrastructure of his kingdom crumbling. During this period, food shortages and corruption were not uncommon. In an attempt to regain control of his kingdom and win favor, the Shah succumbed to clerical pressure and lifted much of his father's bans, including the one on pilgrimage to Mecca. However, insecure and worried with competition, the Shah soon exiled and even killed all who dared to oppose him. During his reign, it was said that over thousands of political prisoners and protesters were killed. Exact numbers, however, are unknown. Alliances with the United States increased their revenue from oil, but also corruption as well. The Shah continued his father's modernization efforts. He worked to erase corruption, but he was far too late. Much of his people grew increasingly unsatisfied with the Shah's oppression and attempts to modernize Iran, and many protesters took to the streets of Iran to voice their complaints against the Shah.
Mr. President, Mrs.
Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, in particular, was known for voicing his objections against the Shah. Talk of a revolution was heard throughout all of Iran, and revolutionaries quickly grew in number. The people of Iran were simply tired of Shah's rule. Khomeini led the protesters, the revolutionaries, against the Shah. As a result, Khomeini was jailed several times, but only for brief periods of time.
I know, Mr. President, that as you pointed
out, in an attempt to curb Khomeini's influence, the Shah exiled him from Iran, though this was a blunder on his part. Rather than soothing the rising anger and disruption of the protesters, tension grew between them and the Shah. The Shah's pro-American and progressive values only added to this animosity. Khomeini seized this opportunity to take control of Iran. Khomeini and his followers set up a dual government alongside the Shah's, and for a moment of time was political instability. The final blow came on the 10th and 11th of February when Khomeini and other revolutionaries took up arms and fought against the Imperial Guard. The guards, unable to make up of their tanks and armored vehicles, were forced to retreat by order of the Military Supreme Council, who then claimed neutrality between the Shah and revolutionaries. After the Shah's exile, Muhammad Pahlavi Reza, the once great Shah, took refuge in the United States, where he later died of cancer. Ayatollah Khomeini took power, and efforts to reverse modernization went underway. Khomeini would soon change the face of Iran. Countries across the globe acknowledged the shift in power from Iran, but at a time with so many events occurring, reactions to the newly in this time period, a number of events were unfolding across the globe, and countries preoccupied themselves with their own problems and victories. The United States mourned the deaths of victims of DC-20 crash at O'Hare International Airport, which had occurred on May 5, 1979. Over in Eastern Asia, the People's Republic of China invades northern Vietnam, ultimately leading to the Sino-Vietnamese War. St. Lucia gains independence from the United Kingdom. The first fully functional space shuttle, the Columbia, is sent to the John F. Kennedy Space Center for preparations. In April 1979, Iran officially becomes an Islamic republic. In Saudi Arabia, an attempt to seize the Grand Mosque in Mecca ends with a little more than 250 people dead. And in Pakistan, the former Prime Minister Zulfikar Bhutto is executed. Alan M. Cormack and Godfrey N. Hounsfield received a jointly shared Nobel Peace Prize for their development of computer-assisted tomography. Too occupied with their own set of problems, the Iranian Revolution and the change of power went ignored until problems began to rise.
He was seen as regal.
The Iranian Revolution had a lasting impact on not only Iran itself, but other countries as well, inspired many other Middle Eastern nations to revolt against their governments. Iran encouraged the Islamic Revolution and attempted to spread it, much to the displeasure of its Arab neighbors. For the most part, Iran was still at ease with its neighbors, though has shown distaste for secularist countries such as Egypt. Other nations like the United States and United Kingdom suffered from Iran's unstable oil exports, and for periods of time Iran shut off all relations with the West. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, speaks about the Iranian Revolution. During her speech on the foreign policy of Great Britain, she states that the Iranian crisis epitomizes the problems which we face in trying to coexist in a shrinking world where political, economic, and social upheavals are endemic. Some would add religious upheavals to that list, but I do not believe we should judge Islam by events in Iran. Least of all should we judge it by the taking of hostages. There is a tide of self-confidence and self-awareness in the Muslim world which preceded the Iranian Revolution and will outlast its present excesses. The West should recognize this with respect, no hostility. The Middle East is an area where we have much at stake. It is in our own interests, as well as the interests of the people of that region, that they build on their own deep religious traditions. We do not wish to see them succumb to the fraudulent appeal of important ex-Marxism. That being said, it was quite clear that Iran's Islamic regime was problematic to other countries. As a major oil producer, Iran had a profound effect on other countries. Everyone needed oil, and Iran had lots of it. But the United States had been the most impacted out of them all. Initially strong allies prior to the revolution, the United States was shocked when it met with harsh treatment from Iran. News of fundamentalists supporting anti-American campaigns stunned America, and in an attempt to normalize relations, the United States sent a diplomat to Iran. However, the diplomat was met with extreme hostility and was forced to resign. This event, along with the 1979 hostage situation in Tehran, led to a strained relationship between the U.S. and Iran. This crisis was so problematic that it heavily influenced the 1982 presidential elections in America. To this very day, relations between the United States and Iran remain very fragile, though both nations are on much better terms than before. Life in Iran was difficult, especially for women. Gender inequality prevailed, and women were forced to wear the veil. If the woman did not comply, she was subject to scrutiny and harassment. However, men, too, had to adhere to clothing regulations. Politically, the rights of women were restricted with education. In some universities, women were unable to major in fields such as engineering and medicine. Conversely, some universities restricted men from entering fields such as political science and library studies. But gender roles were still strict, and women were expected to be subordinate to men. Even to this day, women in Iran are feeling the injustice and prejudice of this. Khomeini even lowered the marriage age from 18 to 9 and restricted women from rising to high positions like judges. Western influences such as hip-hop and westernized dress was prohibited. Life outside the home was completely monitored, and groups such as the Guardians of the Revolution surveyed the streets and eyed the people's movements. As it was an Islamic republic, many were expected to pray from anywhere between 5 to 10 times a day. The economy slightly suffered and unemployment rose due to a temporary hiatus on universities, but overall remained the same as before, albeit the oil industry was slightly shaken. Although this type of lifestyle may seem restrictive to some, it was what the people had wanted. They had wanted a fundamentalist Islamic republic, and they had gotten it. In the end, only time will tell what happens to Iran. The future for the country remains hidden, and no one may ever know what will happen. Iran may eventually come to modernize itself once again, or it may remain as it is. But the history will not be forgotten. By turning back the clock, we will remember how it all began. It all started with Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution.